Welcome. My name is Eric Landrum. I'm from the Department of Psychology at Boise State University, and welcome to my Psych 487 Capstone History and Systems lecture on cognitive psychology and applied psychology. This is actually the last lecture in the Psych 487 History and Systems course sequence. Cognitive psychology, it's difficult to pinpoint when exactly it began. Here are some possible starting dates. Actually, you could reach back in the 1960s, as you'll see here on some of the following screens. But in 1975, psychology textbooks, in particular introductory psychology textbooks, begin to define psychology as the science that studies behavior and mental processes. So when you see that phrase mental processes creep back in to the definition of psychology, that's one indicator of the start of the cognitive revolution, so to speak. In 1979, the American Psychologist, which is the flagship journal of the American Psychological Association, which is, by the way, the largest association of psychologists on the planet, publishes an article called Behaviorism and the Mind, a limited call for a return to introspection. And what this is alluding to is that we need to go back as a discipline and start thinking about what's going on internally, those things that we cannot see, touch, taste, smell, and hear, but then go beyond that to the mental processing as opposed to the physical overt behaviors that behaviorism suggested that we could only study. Edward Tolman suggested the use of and used intervening variables to allow that study of internal unobservable states so long as they are operationally defined. And so it's fine to study things like critical thinking as long as you can define critical thinking in such a way where it was measurable, where we operationally defined this unseeable, if you will, state of mind into one that could be measured and quantified and measured with both validity and reliability. The beginnings, or perhaps the seedlings of cognitive psychology, could go back as far back as 1956, where you see that Jerome Bruner and George Miller published an article, A Study in Thinking, that suggested that higher mental processes could be studied experimentally. In 1960, at Harvard University, the same Jerome Bruner and George Miller begin the Center for Cognitive Studies. And so you can see somewhere between the late 50s, gets its inkling, the ideas get planted, into the 60s and into the 70s, you start to see that emergence of what today we call cognitive psychology. That definition continues to be concerned with the process of knowing, and so thought, that notion of cognition or knowledge and thought that we possess. These are mental processes and events that are not immediately available to us. And so cognitive psychology is not limited to overt behaviors, but covert behaviors. And so what's going on internally, the thought processes. The notion of cognitive psychology is that overt behavior can be valuable. We're not throwing out behaviors, and we're just saying that we should broaden the approach to include not only overt behaviors, as behaviorism does, but also those covert behaviors that we do not directly see, those higher mental processes. Cognitive psychology is a throwback in some ways to functionalism and structuralism. The researchers who study cognitive psychology are interested in the mind structure, the organizing of experience, how it brings coherence to daily life and the interpretation of daily events. The behaviorists would say that the mind has no organizational abilities, or probably even more, or practically speaking, the behaviorists would say, if it's not directly observable, even though it might exist, it's not the purview of psychology. And so many times behaviorists just defined away issues within the psychological realm because they didn't seem to fit a tight and tidy explanation of the behaviors that are directly observable and quantifiable. So in cognitive psychology, then, there is an organization impinged upon or enacted by the person. And so the individual actively and creatively organizes stimuli received from the environment. And that's kind of that notion between the difference between sensation and perception. Sensation is the data gathering, but perception is the data analysis. And so we are using our cognitive processes to help interpret the events that are going on in the world. We're not just the passive recipients. And so this kind of gets beyond that behaviorist notion of blank slate. And so in the behaviorist notion, the idea is that the world impinges these stimuli on us and then we react. And so the environment controls our behavior. Cognitive psychology takes some of that control back and gives the individual some that internal guiding force. We have some free will now. We're not just at the beck and call of the environment and stimuli that are going to lead to our responses. We act upon the environment as well. We interact with the stimuli and the environmental concerns. In cognitive psychology, the idea is that we participate in the acquisition of and the use of knowledge. We pay attention as opposed to the stimuli drawing our attention by visual or auditory signals. We don't call it cognitivism like we would structuralism or functionalism. As of this date, it really hasn't been labeled as such. Typically, you'll hear more of the phrase cognitive psychology or the cognitive psychology revolution. To be honest with you right now, cognitive psychology is hot within the realm of psychology as well as neuroscience. Those are probably two of the leading areas within that kind of cross-cut psychological thought right now. Both cognitive psychology and neuroscience are quite popular within psychology. Some of the criticisms of cognitive psychology would include that it's really fairly young in terms of movements and systems within psychology. There always has been some confusion about terminology and operational definitions. It tends to be kind of trendy and fashionable and overused. The contributions of cognitive psychology, well, it's really kind of too early to tell. There's certainly a revisiting of consciousness. Remember, conscious processes was all but, banned from the notion of behaviorism. Neo-behaviorism starts to bring it back with the notion of logical positivism. But now back to cognitive psychology, now we're right back in the smack of consciousness, and we're studying consciousness, but we're trying to apply the scientific principles of the research methodology that psychologists have been known for over 100 years. And now it really comes down to about operational definitions and how we can define those unobservable events from the mind's eye, if you will, in such a way that cognitive psychologists can do valid and reliable work using empirical research methods. So that's really where it is with regard to cognitive psychology. Applied psychology is very much kind of a parallel process, a parallel sequence of events that really overlap with the timelines that we've talked about in this class so far. Applied psychology really talks about what happens in the workplace or what happens outside the laboratory, outside of academia. So there's growth in psychology during World War I, and there was this realization amongst the public and amongst government officials that psychology could actually be used to improve human welfare. After World War I, psychology becomes the national mania. And if you hearken back to that day, there's not a lot of newspaper articles anymore or columns in the newspaper about psychologists because so much of that has moved to blogs and online. But if you're old enough to remember Dear Abby and things like that, in the 1920s, there were dozens of syndicated columnists who were psychologists around the country writing daily or weekly advice columns. And so it was highly popularized in the 1920s up until probably maybe 10 to 15 years ago. You could find lots of advice columns, and some of them written, Dr. Joyce Brothers, Dear Abby. There were all kinds of different variations on that making psychology public type of theme. After World War I, it becomes the national mania. Psychologists can write these columns, and psychologists claim they can cure marital harmony problems. They can help you find job satisfaction in the workplace, and we can help Madison Avenue find the best way to sell deodorant. By World War II, and I've alluded to this in a number of different lectures now, applied psychology experiences a dramatic growth spurt, and so we're going to see college and university psychologists no longer are in the majority. And actually, I'll show you a table here in a bit about the American Psychological Association. That's just one a benchmark for looking at the change and the trends in psychology over time. And so applied psychology will also include things like clinical counseling, school psychology, people who work in government settings, who work for the military. And so it's really the notion of taking those academic concepts and applying them in the real world. And that's very broadly defined with respect to applied psychology. So here's that example I told you about with the American Psychological Association. And so if you looked at the total membership in 1940, 1962, and 1980, you can see in 1940 it was a 3-to-1 ratio of academics to applied psychologists. But by 40 years later, you can see this trend reversing. In 1980, 42% academic and 58% applied. In fact, this is going to be one of those factors as that proportion continues in the trend that you see that by 1988, 1989, there's going to be a splinter group that breaks off from the American Psychological Association. And in 1989, they're going to form what's called the American Psychological Society, APS, which has actually now been renamed the Association of Psychological Science. So it still has the acronym APS, but this is a splinter group of relatively hardcore scientists who see who see APA becoming much more driven by clinical and counseling needs and leaders when the applied folks become the majority in APA. And so these folks branch off and split off in 1989 and form APS, which again today is the Association of Psychological Science. A big part of the applied psychology movement comes out of the application of what occurs in the laboratory to the real world. And a great example of that is psychological testing. And so the early folks, you've heard these names already in prior lectures, Sir Francis Galton, James Cattell, they used sensory motor tests to determine intelligence. Alfred Binet, working in France in 1904, he's asked by the Ministry of Education to help develop a test that will help differentiate those children who should go to school and who are, in his phrase, educable, versus those children where, for whatever type of situation or disorder or malady, school just is not really for them. There's not going to be a benefit. It's the idea of foreign government, any type of government getting the most bang for the buck. And so they turn to Alfred Binet to help develop this test to differentiate those who are educable versus those who are not. And so Binet becomes very famous, and then others are going to follow in his footsteps and also become famous in this path towards developing psychological tests that can measure intelligence. So Binet's test in 1904 focuses on judgment, comprehension, and reasoning. In 1908, he develops the concept of mental age. That mental age formula is actually still used for children today. There are other variations of the formula, and by the way, Binet's original formula does not work well for adults. And if you take the Psych 421 psychological measurement class, I'm sure that you can dig into that even further. So Goddard introduces the Binet test in the U.S. He translates it. He calls it the Binet-Simon Measuring Scale for Intelligence. He uses it at the Vineland Training Center in Vineland, New Jersey. He uses it with individuals who are mentally retarded. At Stanford University, a professor named Louis Terman in 1916 revises not only the Binet but the Binet-Simon test. He calls it the Stanford Binet, in part to the founder of the test, Alfred Binet from France, and in part in reverence to the university he's working at, Stanford University. And to this day, it's still this variation, and later generations of this test are called the Stanford Binet test of intelligence. Terman is also credited with inventing the term IQ, which is an abbreviation for intelligence quotient, and that's in reference to the original formula, which involved the answer to a division problem. And so, for example, it would have been something like mental age divided by chronological age times 100 equals a person's IQ. There would be a ratio there of mental age to chronological age and converted into IQ points. So Terman is going to be a huge player in that developmental history of intelligence testing in psychology. In World War I, it begins. Robert Yerkes is the president of the American Psychological Association. Remember, APS doesn't exist until 1989. Yerkes wants psychology to help in the war effort. Very patriotic approach on his part, as were many people, many people in the United States at the time. And so he wants psychologists to help with the assessment of intelligence of soldiers. And so perhaps more intelligent soldiers become officers. Maybe they go on for special training to operate special equipment. And so so essentially the notion is in World War I, finding the right man for the right job, essentially. So the Stanford Binet is an individual intelligence test. These days it takes, probably at least 3 hours to give it individually. And if you're inducting tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of soldiers during the height of World War I on a weekly or monthly basis, you cannot afford to give a 3-hour intelligence test individually, one-on-one, for every recruit. And so the task becomes for Yerkes and APA to develop a group test. And so to be much more efficient, to be able to process men and women becoming enrolled in the military much quicker. And so they take the Stanford Binet, they take some of the basic underpinnings, and Yerkes, working with a team of psychologists, start working on this notion of how can we do mass testing of individuals to facilitate the speed and the scoring of intelligence tests. So Otis, who was actually a student of Terman's, develops the multiple choice test. So there you go. If you want to have someone to blame for all the multiple choice, bubble sheets, Scantron, online types of tests that you've taken in your life, it would be Otis, who was a student of Terman's. Develops that multiple choice test. The Army and those psychologists who've been assigned to assist in the Army war effort, they modify Otis's test in what's called the Army Alpha and Army Beta. And to be honest with you, this is actually pretty fascinating stuff. And so the Army Alpha becomes a multiple choice test for those who can read and write. But think about a number of immigrants that are into the country by World War I. Think about the number of people who may not have gone to school. They may come from a rural background. They are spending their entire lives on the farm, in the fields. They're not going to school. World War I comes. It's a very patriotic time. People are enrolling in the military. So you've got to have a test for non-native English speakers, or for those who might speak English but are illiterate because of the schooling or the environment or the situation or whatnot. And so the Army, in conjunction with APA and Yerkes, develop the Army Beta. And the Army Beta is a test for people who don't speak English or who are completely illiterate. And you deliver the Army Beta in pantomime. Think about the challenge of that. Think about if you had to administer an intelligence test, but you couldn't say anything, because either the people could not understand English, or they understood English, but they were illiterate to the point at which they could basically just barely operate within society. And so think about the novelty, the creativity, the ingenuity of delivering the instructions to Army Beta in pantomime. It just astounds me of how creative these individuals had to be. And so I know we don't often think about psychology being creative, especially when you're dealing with 1-inch margins in APA format, but here's a delightful case of where a really creative, innovative solution had to be found, and it was found in the time of need in psychology and in the United States. Well, the unfortunate thing is that Army Alpha and Army Beta weren't finished until about 3 months before the end of World War I. And of course, when you're in the middle of a world war, or any war, I suppose, you don't really know when it's going to end. And so the bad news for the military is that there wasn't much benefit to be gained in the last 3 months of the war. The benefit for psychology was huge, because now there's essentially a proven track record, and so that we can utilize the expertise of psychology and psychologists to help with classification, selection, training of soldiers. And so it gets its start really through World War I. It's going to be a much more major player in World War II. So this notion of psychological testing becomes very commonplace for job applicants, school children, college applicants. And in fact, we spend a lot of time, whether it's the SAT or ACT to get into college, or the GRE to get into graduate school, or at the DMV to get your driver's license. At least in the younger years of life, there's a great deal of time spent in elementary, secondary, and post-secondary school settings where tests are important. Now, to be honest with you, after you get the last degree you're going to have, whether that's a bachelor's, a master's, or whatever, there's really not a lot of tests that one takes in life. Maybe that occasional DMV, multiple choice test to get your driver's license. But with regard to taking tests for job placement or to get your nursing degree or to become a teacher, that certification tests are certainly part of those processes. So IO psychology, by the way, IO stands for Industrial Organizational Psychology, really kind of gets its start with Walter Dill Scott in 1908. He publishes a book called The Psychology of Advertising. With the help of IO psychologists during World War I in 1917, IO psychologists assist in the development of a rating scale for selecting captains. And so you got folks in the military and who should be promoted and who should be kept at their current rank. IO psychology helps out in that effort. After the war is over, some of those techniques are, generalized to other corporate situations. And so in the 1920s, IO psychologists are going to help focus on the selection and placement of job applicants. And so whether with testing or with actually assessment center approaches, all kinds of tools in the tool bag of an IO psychologist are going to become influential and essential to the operations of the workforce in terms of our work life and hiring, firing, promotions, demotions, remediation, all of those types of processes. IO psychologists did and continue to greatly contribute to those accomplishments. There's a classic study in 1927 by two researchers from the University of Minnesota. They're called the Hawthorne Studies. They were done at a Western Electric plant in northern Illinois. They examined human relations, motivation, morale, and the fascinating thing that came out of that study is that when they tried to manipulate the environmental conditions in terms of heat and light and breaks and humidity, comfort, extra meal breaks, no meal breaks, longer hours, shorter hours. What happened in that study that was kind of innovative is that because they had placed these 6 individual assembly line workers in a room, no matter what you threw at them, even variables intended to decrease productivity, these 6 individuals banded together. They didn't want to let down the team. They didn't want to embarrass the plant they worked for. And so what happened in the Hawthorne studies is that the subjects kind of on their own spontaneously banded together for the good of the cause. Whereas that wasn't the point of the study, but that's certainly the take-home point of the study with regard to that social aspect of the environment was much more important than the physical conditions of light and heat and comfort level. By World War II, psychologists are in great demand. 2,000 psychologists are needed with the onslaught of soldiers coming home from World War II. You'll see some statistics here in a second. I've got it on the next slide or so. And so clinical psychology really gets its bump. I mean, clearly you can see here an example. Lightmer Whitner in 1896 really kind of starts clinical psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. But psychology is not known at that time as a helping profession. Psychology aspires to be a science of behavior and to measure things, like the stream of consciousness or, those overt behaviors the neo-behaviors we wanted to focus on. And so the first child guidance clinic opens in 1909 in Chicago by Healy. By 1940, clinical psychology is still a minor area in psychology. And so it's really much more the psychoanalysts who are much more focused on the helping profession notion of a therapeutic approach. It's not until the onslaught and aftermath of World War II where we see the exponential growth in the need for clinical psychologists to help with the soldiers who are coming back from World War II with psychological wounds in addition to physical wounds. And so you can see a little bit of the historical sequence here. That dramatic change is due to World War II. So the Army establishes a training program for clinical psychologists, and that's really much funded and organized by the Veterans Administration, the VA. They train hundreds and hundreds of psychologists at the time that are needed to treat the emotional disturbances of military personnel returning back from World War II. And you have to remember, though, as technology gets better in wars and warfare, that means that medical technology has to also get better. And so what happened is that rather than men who might have died in World War I due to the lack of medical care and triage on the field of battle, by World War II, medical technology is getting better, which means fewer men are dying, which means they're coming home alive. And that's a good thing, don't get me wrong, but they're coming home with more severe psychological disorders because they've had an arm blown off or their legs, have been blown off by a mortar shell in the middle of a war, that kind of thing. And so the folks who are coming home, that not only are there higher volumes of folks coming home after World War II, but they're coming home proportionally with more physical disorders, which might actually also be a cause or related to psychological disorders. So you see this growth in the need during World War II and in the aftermath of World War II. So you can see here after the war, there's even a greater need. And so the Veterans Administration starts funding graduate students to go to graduate school in clinical psychology in exchange for work from those students after their clinical training is complete. And so these days, clinical psychologists are now employed not only by the military, but also mental health centers and clinics and schools and industry, private practice. Clearly, we're going to employ them in educational settings because they're going to need to be the ones training future clinical and counseling psychologists. And so the psychology that we know of today really wasn't that way in 1940. So it's really a dramatic change if you look at it from a historical perspective. There's really two major training models for clinical psychologists. And so the original one that comes about in 1946 is called the Boulder model. And that's after Boulder, Colorado, where psychologists held this meeting where they determined what the curriculum would look like for a PhD clinical psychologist who's trained in what is called the scientist practitioner model. And the scientist practitioner model essentially means that you are trained as a hardcore scientist where you can actually conduct original research and a practitioner at the same time where you can use the outcomes of that kind of hardcore research in a practice with individuals doing psychotherapy. And so the PhD is awarded to a scientist practitioner model training program where you're earning your doctorate in clinical psychology because you've both got the science side of it, but you've also got the helping skills, the helping profession, clinical skills as well. And so they hold that meeting in 1946, and we have the Boulder model where folks get their PhD in psychology. This, here are the numbers. This issue of needing these clinical psychologists becomes pretty critical because by April of 1946, the Veteran Administration has 44,000 patients in hospitals across the U.S. and in military installations around the world, and 30 of them are in neuropsychiatric wards. And so, I'm sorry, not 30, but 30,000. 30,000 of those 44,000 patients have some sort of psychological disorder that needs the care and expertise of a clinical psychologists. And so if you are in 1940 and the clinical psychology is not a big deal, and 6 years later you've got 30,000 patients to treat, you're going to be in a great deal, in a very accelerated need of clinical psychologists, which was one of the reasons the VA got involved. And it was, although it really spurned and stimulated the growth of clinical psychology. In some ways, it's very self-serving in a good way, meaning the VA wanted to help pay for the education of these students because the VA desperately needed the expertise in their hospitals to help these 30,000 folks coming home from World War II that have some sort of neuropsychological condition. Alternatively, from the Boulder model, the Vail model comes along in 1973, and the Vail model is named after Vail, Colorado. So one of the things that you can see right away is that the clinical psychologists who met on these issues, they like to ski. They went to Boulder, they went to Vail. Anyway, so in the Vail model, the proper training is as a practitioner, which not only can be gained from a regular department of psychology in the traditional academic standing or setting, but you can also do that in a freestanding professional program. And so some departments of psychology around the United States offer a clinical psychology doctorate where you can get your PsyD. Baylor University, for example, in Waco, Texas, is one of the first schools in the nation that actually offered the PsyD in clinical psychology. But there are also freestanding schools, and maybe the one that's most popular is Argosy University. If you do a web search in Argosy University, you'll find out that they have different locations around the country. It is a university system, but it's a specialized school. And so all they do at Argosy University in the Department of Psychology is crank out clinical PsyDs. And the notion being that the PsyD won't typically be the originator and contributor to the research domain, but they are the consumer of it. And so they can become specialists in the helping profession in the application of those principles rather than the generation of those principles. That's going to take the scientist part. That's the scientist practitioner PhD. But the PsyD then is the degree where you are a specialist as a practitioner and you are a savvy consumer of the psychological knowledge that may be being generated by many disciplines and subdisciplines in psychology and the clinical PhD students as well. Anyway, that's it for both a